We're going to take a little detour back into some scientific concepts, and then we'll relate how all of these work together. Okay, so optimal grip. This is a skill that I think is at the core of Enlightenment. Optimal grip is a cognitive norm operating on behavior, grounded in how the nervous system relays information between the environment and one's experience of the environment. So as I go, I'm going to make a little bit more sense of this. That's probably a bit opaque right now. But it might be the case also that this phenomena of optimal grip is essential to life, which is, I actually really like that the acronym is OG. What separates living systems from non-living systems is precisely their ability to negotiate their grip on the world, to change their behaviors and perceptions in order to persist in an ever-changing world. It's what makes organisms robust and resilient and able to propagate across time. A rock doesn't really have the same degree of flexibility, and whatever conditions you subject a rock to, it's going to be subject to them. It can't really reorganize its experience in order to live a better life for a rock. So this concept comes first from the philosophical tradition of phenomenology. So phenomenology is an approach to our perception, to our subjective conscious experience, which attempts to apply a number of techniques to the analysis of the elements of your experience. And one of the more famous phenomenologists his name is Merleau-Ponty. He was a French writer. He wrote this great book called The Phenomenology of Perception in 1945. It was very much influenced by his observations of victims of the First and Second World Wars and how their experience, how their actions, how their behaviors would change given different injuries that they sustained during the war. But he talks about many things, because this book is about 600 pages long, if not more. And he addresses here the concept of optimal grip. So I will read what he says about that. For each object, as for each picture in an art gallery, there is an optimum distance from which it requires to be seen, a direction viewed from which it vouchsafes most of itself. At a shorter distance, we have merely a perception blurred through excess or deficiency. We therefore tend towards the maximum of visibility and seek a better focus, as with a microscope. So in interacting with any object, there's a best way to interact with that object. And we have a number of intuitive impulses to interact with that object in such a way that it fosters that optimal grip. And this happens very evidently in your social life, right? There are certain distances that we are trying to maintain between people when we interact with them. It would be very weird if I was standing on your foot as I was giving this presentation. That would not be an optimal grip. You'd feel very uncomfortable. So we're negotiating this kind of grip on reality at all times. It's something that is implicit and intuitive and governs how we navigate our social reality, how we navigate our intellectual reality. And how does that work? Okay, so in order to talk about how that works, we have to talk about perception. The subject of enlightenment is such a large one because you have to have a theory of what an organism is, of what the world is, of what perception and action are, of what objects are, and all of this crazy stuff. So we're going to start with perception. So perception is a fundamentally predictive process. There used to be this thought that what we were doing when we were looking at objects was cataloging an objective picture of sense data that was in the world. And this picture is ultimately a feed-forward kind of picture where information is coming into me from the world, it's going up into this neural hierarchy that I have, and then that's all being reconstructed in some representational space as a sort of objective picture of what's out in the world. But that didn't really work, and it was really hard to build robots that did anything if we tried to make them see that way. So there's this model called predictive processing, which adds another layer of information onto this perceptual system. So perception is not a passive feed-forward affair. It's extensively modulated by top-down feedback connections from downstream neural assemblies, which really simply looks like this. Okay, so we have a sensory organ that's getting light and all of this stuff from the world. That's sending it up into our brain. And at the same time, our brain, at the upper regions of its cortical hierarchy. So there's a number of different layers, especially in your cortex. It's got a very strong and observable hierarchy. The upper regions of that hierarchy, the part of your brain that's sort of like wrapped around the whole top of it, is usually what's referred to as the association cortex. It holds a bunch of, it holds a memory of past instances of experience that you've had, and via those retained past impressions, it sends predictive signals to meet the incoming information from your sense apparatus, and through that through those two streams of information, they sort of mutually coordinate, one changes the other, and you get your experience. And experience only manifests when there is a match between your predictive signals and your sensory signals at several layers of the cortical hierarchy. And how your perception changes is if there is significant enough error, if there is significant enough mismatch between your sensory signals coming in from your sense organs and your predictive signals coming down from the top regions of your brain. If there's enough mismatch, then the sensory signals will override the predictive signals and your predictions will update, and that will change what is sent downstream in subsequent moments. But if there's only a little bit of mismatch, then the predictive signal basically silences, squashes out the electrical variation in the incoming stream, and you don't get a perceptual update. Right? So if I'm looking at my hand right now, and I begin to move it slowly to the right, my brain is seeing that predicting it here is no longer a relevant thing to do. So it has to sort of yoke to my hand and then update the predictions as error increases as I move it from its expected place. So what happens is we get this thing called a generative model. So a generative model is basically everything that you experience. It's what you do see compared to what you could see but don't. It's a product of the nervous system inferring the plausible causes of stimulus given its past experiences. So everything that you experience isn't the world, it's a model of the world. We, through translating different signals from different information sources in the world, we get a rough human-centric picture of what the reality that we're situated in looks like. And the generative model sets the norms for our system. We have a field of relevance about us, and how we see the world, how we view the world, our intuitions about the world, give us a sense of what's relevant to act on and why. And so it's important to note that the purpose of this generative model is to enable robust and flexible action. The point is not to give you a objectively accurate set of representations about something that is independent of all life forms. That is a really tall order. This generative model, our model of the world, presents organisms with a state of readiness for action to interact with the kinds of environments that that organism is likely to meet. So what do we perceive? This is a term given to the notion of seeing action-relevant types of information. As I've been mentioning, we don't see objective stimulus in the sense that it was thought of in like the 1960s or something like that. What we see is a landscape of affordances. And affordances are for action, right? I see this cup as being graspable. This chair presents itself to me as being sittable. These stairs as walkable. These shoes as wearable. And in our human life, interestingly, the second sentence is really important to highlight. In our human form of life, the landscape of affordances are related to the whole spectrum of abilities available in our socio-cultural practice. Right? So it's not just objects, but ways of relating to people, ways of relating to religious ideas and deities and things like that. The landscape of affordances for human beings involves also the realm of the imagination. Because if I engage with different imaginative objects, like God, we could say that the concept of God is an imaginative object for maybe something beyond us, but maybe something that just enables us to act in the world in a particular kind of way. those things that are introduced into our generative model, into our models of understanding and our models of acting, they transform how we perceive the world as being relevant to act. Okay, so optimal grip is fundamentally a phenomenological notion. It's something which refers to how we experience the world. So we have to ask then, what is it like when we deviate from an optimal grip? What is the experience of an organism when it's not optimally attuned to its environment? Well, according to Bruenberg and Reitwald, who wrote a great paper on optimal grip, they say that the deviation from an optimum can be described as an experienced tension to be reduced. In the case of a skilled individual, tending towards grip is the equivalent of having an action readiness for dealing adequately with an affordance. So let's say, for example, you are speaking to somebody and that person stands uncomfortably close to you. Well, you experience an anxiety. That's a suboptimal grip, and so you back away from them. You have a readiness to act such that you reinstate your experience of what is optimal for that circumstance. And this can apply to anything. Bruenberg and Reitwald are really biased towards talking about the kinds of experiences that an organism already knows how to deal with. They talk about optimal grips in terms of knowing already how to deal with various problems, such as gathering food. They also use the example of what is it like to experience depression, OCD, that kind of thing. What are the already learned skills that an individual has for dealing with their world? But with Enlightenment, there would be the ability to insightfully generate novel affordances for circumstances that you may have not come up against before. And I think that's super important to add to this model, and will be something I'll talk a little bit about as we go. Okay, so how are we generating this experience of discomfort? How are we generating this anxiety? What's going on in the nervous system? So the model of optimal grip and the model of predictive processing is based on something called the free energy principle. And free energy is defined as an information theoretic measure. That's the upper bound on the surprisal of some data given a generative model. So what that means is if something is surprising, there's a lot of uncertainty. And that uncertainty actually in the nervous system also cashes out as a state of disorder. You know, if you have learned responses to things, your brain has learned pathways that it knows how to visit in order to produce a response to adequately deal with something you're familiar with. But if something unfamiliar comes up against you, then it has to search for new pathways. It has to constellate information in novel ways. And this will actually look in the brain like an elevated state of disorder as your nervous system is assisting you in the search for a novel solution. And I think this is a good way of putting it in relation to how we're talking about it with the relationship between an environment and an organism. Roughly, free energy is the measure for the disattunedness of the internal dynamics and the environmental dynamics. So if your internal dynamics, your neural dynamics, are attuned to a system, then they are regular and reliable. They know what to do. There's a lot of efficiency going on in your processing, and your brain isn't really visiting a lot of novel states. It's doing the same thing that it knows how to do, and it's doing it well. But if you are disattuned, then it's going to be a little more sloppy in the brain. It's going to look a little bit more messy, and your brain has to do a lot of novel searching and networking in order to solve the problem that you're trying to solve. Now, a lot of you may have seen this image before. It's very popular in news sources. So this image here on your left is an image of, it's a representation of neural connections in a normal, everyday waking state of consciousness. So when you take a bunch of mushrooms, your brain is talking a lot more across novel areas. So this is also put in terms of an elevation in entropy of neural disorder, an elevation of free energy. And this might be a metaphor of how to look at it, but it's a good way of looking at it. If something is high in free energy, there's a lot of neural energy to be used that's going unused. It's free for diversion into some task. So high free energy, while it is a measure of disattunedness according to this model, you're not always going to come up against something that you know how to deal with. And so being able to enter a state of high neural disorganization, but then also to be able to snap into a new state of order, that is what's going to get you the insightful, flexible kind of problem solving that an enlightened or wise person might be characteristic of such a kind of person. And what I just described there actually is basically what's happening in insight. Your brain sort of snaps out of a system of order. There's a brief period of entropy elevation, and then it reorganizes into a novel state of reduced entropy. So here is, we're all situated in an environment, of course. And I want to emphasize something that's really interesting about the free energy principle, because it's really easy to just talk about internal dynamics, about what's going on in the nervous system, about what's going on inside the organism. And in the ways that neuroscience, cognitive science, psychology are often done, there is this presumed ontological separation between the agent and the environment. I am an object which exists in a field of objects, and there is a fundamental separation between us. But as per Carl Friston in a paper in 2013, an agent does not have a model of its world. It's not something that we sort of have contained within us. The agent is a model. In other words, the form, structure, and states of our embodied brains do not contain a model of the sensorium, of that which we experience in our sensory states. They are that model. And every aspect of our brain and body can be predicted from our environment. So why do we have the kinds of eyes that we do? Well, there's a particular kind of radiation in the environment which is conducive to us perceiving certain kinds of things that are useful for a human organism. Why do we have the kinds of ears that we have? Well, because a particular kind of vibratory sensation benefits from a particular kind of organization. And this applies throughout, right? Organisms, their whole bodies match to the environment, and they become one with. They try to fit into that environment as best they can. And there's all sorts of ways that organisms exchange energy with the environment, right? One of the primary ways is through eating things, and through the excretion of waste. That's a form of energetic exchange with the environment, where we take parts of the environment, we turn it into us, and there's also other methods, such as niche construction. So we all act on the world in particular kinds of ways. We build homes for ourselves, beavers build dams, we cause climate change, and all of that changes the entire world, and we're really seeing that really clearly right now, of course, with that whole climate change thing. It's very, very obvious that us in amidst an environment, we're not wholly separate. Everything that we do has consequences, and those consequences are sometimes pretty drastic. They also specify the conditions for the evolution of future organisms that live within the conditions that we set for them. So there is a fundamental ontological connection between organisms and environment. We are sort of continuous with the field of being.